I said earlier this morning, actually, that when we speak about Durban, the flip side of Durban is the delegitimization of Israel. And delegitimization has multiple forms. There's a specific form that I have dealt with over the last number of years that I think comes up and is relevant for our discussion this morning. It will take us into the nuts and bolts of Israeli security. But in my judgment, it is something which I think I want to call to your attention. All of you remember the Second Lebanon War, which occurred in the middle of 2006, and there was a very serious negotiation as the Second Lebanon War came to an end, which led to a UN Security Council resolution called 1701. It was the ceasefire resolution. The key figure, if there's anything good in UN Security Council Resolution 1701, it's because Ambassador John Bolton represented the United States and sat opposite his French counterpart and hammered in very serious security clauses into that UN resolution. In Israel, when this resolution was passed after we went through this horrible war with Hezbollah, many people hailed the resolution because it was supposed to lead to a very different outcome. At some point, there were those who suggested that Resolution 1701 be a Chapter 7 resolution, like the resolutions against Iraq and against Iran. It wasn't put in, but the idea was to put in very robust security measures to prevent the same kind of crisis from occurring that had led to the Second Lebanon War. Now, just to mention three elements that were put into 1701, one idea was to have enhanced international forces, not just rely on third world countries that would be deployed in southern Lebanon for UNIFIL, but to have countries like Spain, France, Italy send forces that would help serve as a buffer between Israel's northern border and the area of southern Lebanon. There was also a notion of trying to block the transfer of weapons into Lebanon, specifically for Hezbollah, although Hezbollah is not mentioned by name. For example, few people know this, the German Navy got involved in blockade actions in the Mediterranean off the Lebanese coast to prevent smuggling, because the Eastern Mediterranean happens to have been filled over the last number of years with Iranian weapons ships, taking weapons from Bandar Abbas, the major port of the Iranian Navy in the Persian Gulf, all the way through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and heading for the shores of Lebanon. There was an effort to speak about blocking the transfer of weapons from Syria into Lebanon, because the normal route that Hezbollah received its weapons was by aircraft, cargo aircraft that came from Iran to Damascus International Airport. Those cargo aircraft were unloaded and the weapons were transferred to the Bekaa in eastern Lebanon for Hezbollah. So there were provisions put in that if the Lebanese government needed the assistance of UNIFIL, it could block the transfer of those weapons. But the most important feature of Resolution 1701 was the creation of a huge buffer area between the Litani River and the Lebanese border. You're going to have maps very soon. And in that area, the resolution was very clear. There could be no military forces deployed between the Israeli-Lebanese border and the Litani River, no military forces deployed, except for those of UNIFIL or the Lebanese army. This was sought as a way of keeping out rockets, keeping out Hezbollah operatives, keeping out those same Hezbollah gunmen who shot at our soldiers along the border that led to the war and kidnapped Israelis into Lebanese territory. Could you please put up that display that I gave you? So this is obviously a very small PowerPoint that I prepared for our meeting today. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see here what is written in Resolution 1701. First of all, the creation of the security arrangements between the blue line, that's the international border, and the Litani River. That is emphasized in bold. Next slide, please. Also, there's the definition of what UNIFIL is supposed to do. That's the international forces in Lebanon. They're supposed to assist the Lebanese armed forces in taking steps toward the establishment of that area between the Litani River and the international border. Next slide, please. But what has happened is that you can see, although I was expecting a bit of a larger screen, that the entire area between the river, which you can see is there in blue, down to the Israeli border, is no longer just empty of weaponry or Hezbollah operatives. It's full of weaponry and full of Hezbollah operatives. In fact, you can see that there are storage areas, launch sites for rockets, all identified. This is an Israeli military map. All of this is grown. To give you just a sense, so we won't just look at maps, in 2006, when that war broke out, called the Second Lebanon War, there were 15,000 rockets in the hands of Hezbollah. 10,000 of those rockets were in southern Lebanon. Today, the total rocket force of Hezbollah has gone from 15,000 to 40,000. And in that area that was supposed to be a special zone, a special area without weapons, there are now 30,000 rockets in violation of Resolution 1701. But now I'm going to bring you to the really heart of the security issue that I wanted to show you. Can I have the next slide, please? What has happened is that Hezbollah and its generals have been sitting, in my judgment, with the Goldstone report in their laps and have been systematically putting Hezbollah's Iranian weaponry into the heart of Lebanese villages in that security zone south of the Litani and north of the border. This is an aerial photograph in which, in fact, there's an explanation as to what each of these sites are. This is the village of El Khiyam. It's a Shiite village about 4 or 5 kilometers north of the border, where you have about 25,000 residents, and the area has been completely filled with weaponry next to schools, hospitals, in the basements of civilian homes. Any of you who remember the Goldstone report should look at this picture, and this should remind you of a scenario which we faced only a few years ago in the Gaza Strip. This is exactly what Gaza City looked like. And it creates, obviously, a dilemma for Israel when Israel faces rocket fire from a terrorist organization that has embedded itself in the civilian population, whether you're talking about El Khayam village or you're talking about Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip. And what's the dilemma? What do you do when you face rocket fire from heavily populated villages aimed at your own civilian population, at your own country? What do? You can say, well, I won't do anything. I can't do anything because if I take measures, I'll be condemned. You can say, you know what? I'm going to operate like the Russian army in Chechnya, and we're going to mow this place down. Well, that is not what Israel's about. And it doesn't matter whether there's a CNN correspondent present or not. That is not how the Israeli army wages war. Now, what Israel does do when it maintains its right of self-defense is it seeks to do the exact opposite of what Hamas did in the Gaza Strip and what Hezbollah is doing again today in southern Lebanon. And that is finding ways of separating the military forces of our adversary from the civilian population. Now, that is very hard to do. Israel, of course, did it in the Gaza Strip by multiple warnings to the population, including phone calls to the individual homes of people who had Hamas weaponry in their basements. There's a whole unit of Israeli military intelligence of Arabic speakers who receive phone numbers and actually phone people to leave their house. You have 7 minutes to leave your house. We know you have Grad rockets in the basement. Get out. We're going to destroy this. It's a military target under international law. So that way we separated the two. Now, we don't have an impending conflict with Lebanon or with Hezbollah today. We hope the area stays quiet. But how can we leave a situation like this? How can we leave Israeli commanders with a dilemma? And please listen to this dilemma. Do they act in order to protect Israeli civilians in northern Israel, or do they act to protect Lebanese civilians whose basements are full of weapons? Now, I'm going to make a very practical suggestion here, which I don't think has much of a chance of happening. But nonetheless, the United Nations has a moral responsibility to address this problem. In Gaza, there are no UN forces, and we had to solve this by ourselves. But in southern Lebanon, you have a UN Security Council resolution, 1701. You have international forces deployed called UNIFIL. And UNIFIL at least should try to go into these villages and take the weapons out. Now, do I think that's going to happen? Like I think it's going to snow in July. It's not going to happen. But we should make that demand. The UN should defend the principles of protection of civilians. That's what it talks about across the street. But it won't do it. So that leads me to what is the lesson for Israel from this experience, where terrorism uses civilians as human shields, whether in Gaza or in southern Lebanon, where situations like this are created. And since I don't expect UNIFIL to act to clean this up, even though I'm making a formal public plea that it do so, we have to learn the lesson for what we do later in subsequent Arab-Israeli diplomacy. Today, there is a claim made to Israel that it should concede certain areas in the West Bank that are vital for Israeli security and pull out the Israeli military, which today keeps us safe, and instead rely on international forces. By the way, this view doesn't only come from people who happen to have coffee in the Indonesian lounge inside the UN. This comes from Israelis. Today, if you pick up the New York Times, and I don't like to do this here overseas, but I have to, you have an article by our former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who not only suggests a virtually full withdrawal from the West Bank, but mentions specifically in Jerusalem that the holy city's holy places would be administered jointly with the assistance of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. In other words, who's going to protect the Western Wall? Some international entity. I'm sorry, Mr. Olmert, you're no longer Prime Minister. And we don't need your article calling for the internationalization of Jerusalem in the New York Times when the Prime Minister of Israel is here. The lesson from what is happening here in Lebanon, what has been happening in Gaza, is a fundamental principle that we learned from the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, that only Israel must defend itself by itself. As Alan Dershowitz shared with you, he was there, present at the creation, when Resolution 242 was drafted. It never envisioned Israel withdrawing lock, stock, and barrel from the West Bank. And the reason was very simple, because Israel entered that territory in a war of self-defense. The previous 67 line, you hear everybody walking around going, oh yeah, 67 borders. There were no 67 borders. There was an armistice line from 1949, and if you read the armistice agreement, it says these are not final international borders. The new border had to be negotiated. But 242 established a principle of secure and recognized boundaries, which in shorthand came to be called defensible borders, language first coined by President Ronald Reagan in a public speech. It was for the Reagan Plan, and later followed by Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and most recently used by President George W. Bush in a letter which was supported by both Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress. So Israel must learn the lessons of these murky international peacekeeping situations. And it must defend itself by itself, and it must not agree to the internationalization of its security, whether in the Jordan Valley, which was always viewed as the front line of our defense, or in the heart of Jerusalem, as a former Prime Minister of Israel unfortunately advocated today in the New York Times. Thank you.